The reason that we're here with this hedge is because this is a rarity, a relative rarity in West Dorset, in that it's a recently planted hedge. It's less than 50 years old. It was put here when the bypass came through. The bypass cut across our farm fields and they had to reinstate the hedge boundary, that fence, and this hedge was planted so less than 50 years ago. I don't manage it the same way as the traditional hedges. I allow this to grow up and then I come down and harvest from patches of it, and the wood I harvest is used for structures in our vegetable garden, like pea frames and bean frames and stuff like that. And so it has a use, and then once that season's over it gets stored away and dried and turns into our fire lighting wood. So we never buy any canes imported for the garden structures, and we never buy any fire lighting wood because we've always got well rotted hazel from the previous year's gardening work. The modern hedge, the newer hedge that I showed you earlier, is very narrow. It's about 1.5 meters wide at the most. It's allowed to grow to full length. In its case, we're harvesting wood occasionally, so none of it's going to waste. And okay, it is capturing a lot of carbon, but I can't really understand why its height is the determining factor in providing the conclusion that it is really good at capturing carbon. So this is typical of the West Dorset landscape. We've got a large number of trees populating the hedgerows. We've got some small woodland that's currently not been managed for 50 or maybe 100 years, so it's running wild. Small fields with quite wide hedges surrounding them, and all the fields, we're in West Dorset, remember, are grazing pasture. No arable here, it's clay soil. It's not suited to arable farming. Currently grazed by sheep. Back in the late summer it would have been grazed by cattle. Prior to that it would have been generating hay. So the hedgerow in the foreground here is being allowed to just grow. So that would get maximum points in terms of carbon capture. The hedgerow in the middle distance is another really old hedgerow, 400 or 500 years old, maybe more, really wide. That is flailed every year to encourage a thick growth. So that is a very dense hedge. And for me, that is still capturing a lot of carbon every year, because on the full width of that and on each side there's fresh growth every year, which is just flailed into oblivion, into a powder that drops as litter at the bottom of the hedge. So that's not going back into the atmosphere. So I think that should be recording a very high rate of carbon capture. You can hear running water, that's just a ditch. So, one of the sources of my indignation about people getting this wrong is the fact that an enormous amount of effort has gone into the creation of this hedge. And it wasn't created by me, it wasn't created by my father, it was created generations ago at a time when everything was pretty feudal, labour was cheap, and you'll be pretty sure that the labourers who did this work were not paid a lot of money. I'm not sure that you can be sure they were unhappy, but what they did was magnificent. So there's running water there like a torrent. That is the drainage system for these fields. These fields wouldn't be productive grass pastures if they weren't properly drained. And there's a woodland up there that's called channel stall coppice, which is a weird name for a woodland. Coppice is a form of wood, but the channel stall part of it explains why the wood was put there. It was put there to be an accumulation of water that's come off of the higher fields through the ditches, so it's stalling the flow of water to make it a steady flow of what comes out of that woodland and continues to pick up from all the drains that are underneath this field and fed into that ditch. Those drains were hand dug. They have clay pipes, and that's another whole load of work that most people disregard these days. So we're on a clay valley here, and it would be soggy to a large extent, unmanageable, if those drains weren't in place and if this ditch wasn't in place. And you put the ditch along the side of the hedge because it's a sensible place at the edge of the field to collect above ground water that's been picked up by these underground drains. And of course it flows downhill, so you have hedges that find a gradient to follow so that the ditch at the side of the hedge will pick up the water and manage it down to the stream that joins the river. So old drainage systems, old barriers between fields called hedges, and because there's a lot of stones taken out, there's a big bank in the middle, which is where all the stones were thrown in. And the hedge that was constructed is constructed with a hedge this side of the bank and a hedge that side of the bank. So it's extremely wide. It's even got wider since I laid that hedge probably 5 or 6 years ago, that side and this side. And because it was in a stewardship, we were funded to put some fencing up to protect it. So there's a wire fence here that stops the animals damaging the hedge at that vulnerable stage when you've just laid it. And then John White, who does my hedge cutting, comes along every year and cuts to the same place. Because the fence is there, you can't cut it up against the hedge itself. He cuts up to the wire fence, which means the hedge over the years has become wider than it was designed to be for habitat basis. And it's not high as it normally might be, but it makes that's a height which is manageable for John to keep on top of it. Because it's cut to the same level every year there's new growth from quite low down, which makes it a very thick hedge. This is the thickest hedge you're going to find anywhere. My theory, and it is only theory, is that if you're talking about the carbon that is captured by this hedge, then the fundamental important detail is how high is it, how wide is it at the point where it's cut back to, and recognising it's cut back to that point every year, then the carbon that this has picked up is lots of different components. The obvious one is having cut off with a flail all the new growth, then all that stuff is 1 year's carbon capture, because that is structurally mainly carbon that's come out of the atmosphere. There's a bit going on below ground, and we know from some study that was done that in terms of how much carbon is tied up in this hedge, there's as much underground as there is above ground. More than that we don't need to say, I don't think, at this stage, but each year what grows above this cut line is equal to the above ground carbon captured by this hedge. What happens to it? Well, the flail comes along and smashes it up into small pieces, and a bit like the leaves that come off that tree, it falls as litter to the bottom of the hedge. And that is not going back into the atmosphere. So, put simply, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the impact of this hedge is equal to the growth that is cut off every year. I think it's going to be actually more effective cutting it off every year.
Hmm.
But I'll let some scientists work that out for themselves. At the moment,
What's John's theory, John White's theory as
I
to
don't
why
know.
that
He's
would
got
be
a
the case?
theory about the carbon capture part of it, but he would be very resistant to the idea of cutting it less frequently, because he knows that if he cuts it to this level every year, then he's only cutting small material, which means that it's not going to have a big impact on the hedge. If he cuts stuff that's a few years old, like the small branches that are alongside that tree, so that's like 5 years of growth. If he tries to cut that with a flail, it will just make a hell of a mess and damage the plant right down to the roots, because you're hitting on solid trunk. That's an extreme case, but if he cuts it every couple of years, there's still more damage done. So that's why he doesn't like the idea of doing it less frequently than once a year. The width and the method of management of this hedge, I think, should get some credit. That'll do.
You sure?